In my public analysis work with irrational technology as a project, I often talk about sci-fi, and I talk about what sci-fi can tell us about the technological world. The one sci-fi show that I've never touched on that's actually my favourite sci-fi show of all time is, I've never really spoken about Doctor Who as a lens of analysis because there's almost no public analysis about it, bar that one video on the Kerblam episode in Capitalism. It wasn't until recently that I figured out why this was. If you're coming here from the Doctor Who fandom and you're not a follower of my content, I'm Lou and this is Irrational Technology. I analyse technology and what it means about society from a largely left-wing perspective. I'm an interaction designer by trade and my dissertation in university was on social media literacy, which is rooted in the idea that people have a right to understand the design of the technology that basically controls our lives. I've always been a huge Doctor Who fan, like I said, but I've never really done anything with this information. When I was younger, I never really wanted to admit to everyone how much of a Doctor Who fan I was, and that's kind of followed me into adulthood. But I consume Doctor Who content a lot, especially on YouTube, more than any other medium. So the RTD2 era is arguably been a failure in what it set out to do, and it seems really unclear as to why. People blame it on Disney a lot, and I totally understand that, but I think it's a little more complex than it was Disney's fault because they didn't let Russell do the full run. They didn't let him publish it the way he wanted to. I think it's about a fundamental incompatibility between British sci-fi and American big tech money. Take Star Trek as an example. What Doctor Who was trying to do, what RTD2 was trying to do, was replicate the success of the Star Trek universe, because they've got all sorts of shows shooting off from the original Star Trek. They've got movies, they've got video games, and they make a lot more money at the end of the day than Doctor Who does because of this. And that's what RTD2 was trying to achieve. They was trying to achieve that kind of success with a Tennant era tone to it, because obviously the Tennant era was so successful. If you take Star Trek's technology is prescriptive. It tells you what the future should look like and what values should be encoded into our tools. Information needs to be accessible. Hierarchies should be flat, and the crew need to be able to understand and operate the systems around them. The technology throughout Star Trek expresses the utopia. That's why it generates so much design discourse, because as a designer you can argue with it or from it because its interfaces are coherent. Doctor Who's technology is almost entirely reactive. The TARDIS breaks down when the story needs it to. The sonic screwdriver solves problems when a writer needs a solution. Nothing is really expressing a consistent philosophy about what humanity's relationship with technology or the world should look like. There's also no villain whose ideology is consistently expressed through technology design, the way the Borg are basically a coherent argument about networked capitalism, or the Dominion represent a specific kind of authoritarian technocracy. The Daleks come closest. There's something there about purity, about the body as a kind of failed technology that needs to be replaced by the casing. But the show's never really committed to developing that as a coherent ideological statement across the whole run, the way that Star Trek does. They keep bringing them back as monsters rather than as arguments. American sci-fi, especially TV sci-fi, tends to be systematic. It builds worlds with rules, with consistent internal logic, with institutions. This systematic nature is what makes the technology legible as ideology. British sci-fi, and Doctor Who especially, tends to be episodic and improvisational in a much deeper sense, not just in format but in philosophy. The Doctor is essentially a trickster figure who defeats systems rather than representing one. This is actually a coherent worldview, but it's an anti-systematic one. Even Black Mirror, which is another example of British sci-fi, it's doing serious ideological work with technology, but notably it does it in an anthology format precisely because it doesn't want to sustain a coherent ideology across a long run. There's a tradition in British sci-fi of using technology as atmosphere or texture rather than as argument, which is how it's used in Star Trek. But what if Doctor Who's incoherence about technology is actually more honest about how technology works in the real world than Star Trek's utopian systemism? Because in reality, design is reactive. Most interfaces exist because someone had a problem yesterday, not because someone had a philosophy about the future. The TARDIS is a cobbled together, barely understood, frequently misbehaving object. It's arguably more representative of how we actually inhabit our tools and technology than any Star Trek panel. It's that coherent fictional worlds give audience something to invest in and argue about. The ideology becomes a fan infrastructure, with people debating whether the Federation is actually utopian or whether it's imperialist. They cosplay the uniforms, they build replicas of the interfaces. That systemism generates participation. Can you get that level of audience investment from a show that's philosophically resistant to systemism? I think the answer is yes, but you need to find a different engine for it. Instead of, here's a coherent world with the rules you can master, you need more something like, here's a protagonist whose relationship with the incoherent world you find deeply compelling, which is arguably what the Tennant era achieved. The investment was emotional and character-driven rather than world-driven. The reason RTD2 didn't work is because it tried to replicate that Star Trek format to build out this world with all these spin-off shows and characters. But the way that Star Trek does that is through its coherent ideology. This is a coherent ideology that Doctor Who doesn't possess, but that's a good thing, in my view, because I think it's more accurate. That's how we actually exist in the world, and that's why the Tennant era resonated with so many people. But if you take Disney money and you try to replicate the American way of doing things, you're fundamentally not just not going to resonate with people, because that's not what Doctor Who's about, and it's fundamentally incompatible with that format. Now, that doesn't mean you can't take it to new levels of success. Black Mirror shows this because they have achieved that level of success. If you take the episode Dot and Bubble as an example of that, what it's trying to do is make that Star Trek-like argument about what social media is and how it exists in young people's lives. That's clearly what the episode is reaching for. But for me, as someone who's an expert in this kind of analysis, it just didn't really reach because there wasn't really an argument it was making. But there's an argument to be made there about reactivity. And if you write an episode about social media, an episode like Dot and Bubble, with a more reactive tone to it, where it's not about a coherent worldview where you're trying to do things, it's about this, maybe there's this villain figure at the end that the Doctor discovers who's been driving this whole thing for his own selfish purposes, and there really isn't any coherent ideology beyond he wants to insert evil plan here. That's all to do with his own ends, and this technology has been a tool through which he can achieve his evil ends, or she, you know, I love a female villain, fancy them all, to be honest with you, guilty as charged. And there's an argument there where that's more resonant, because that's what technology is at the end of the day, isn't it? Social media is not expressing a coherent worldview the way that Dot and Bubble or any modern Star Trek analysis of social media seems to argue it is. It's reactive according to the needs of the billionaires, right? Doctor Who can make that argument better than any other show because that's where it rests in, and that's what Tennant was good at. That's what the Tennant era succeeded in. A Tennant era analysis of social media, if you imagine an episode where David Tennant is doing the same things in Dot and Bubble, and it's not a Dr. Light episode. I hate Dr. Light episodes. If you make it not a Dr. Light episode, and you make that the argument, and there's a villain reveal at the end, it'll resonate a lot easier with people. And it's making a unique analysis that Star Trek is never going to make, and that's what sets Doctor Who apart at the end of the day, isn't it? You can also do Boom in a similar way, where this military mechanism is not making a coherent worldview. It's the ends of some one selfish person, for example. You don't necessarily always need to take it that way, but you can show how the military-industrial complex is fundamentally a reactive thing. There's lots of different ways you could express that in an episode like Boom. You can have a foreign entity, you can have cultural differences, you can lean more into the religion aspect. There's lots of ways you can do that. My point at the end of the day is that Doctor Who can succeed in the way that the Tennant era succeeded, in the same way Star Trek succeeds, but it needs to succeed by making its own argument, which is fundamentally ideologically different from the Star Trek argument. And that's why the Tennant era succeeded. The next phase of Doctor Who needs to recognise that and use that as a way to build the show. You can build 10 episodes that really resonate with the issues of today, that examine the reactivity of them, and doing so building a character-driven relationship with whoever is playing the next Doctor. And you can do that with a couple silly filler episodes. The Scribble Monster was season 2. I'm not against the silly episodes. I love the silly episodes. And you can do that whilst not abandoning your principles and trying to be something you're not. But Doctor Who's not going to succeed unless it notices that. That's why RTD2 didn't succeed, because it didn't recognise that that was where the success lay.